Yes, for the Newsfirst team, I'm Niresh Tambi. My guest this evening is Sankhitha Gunaratne, attorney at law, who is the head of governance and anti-corruption and the deputy director at Verite Research, who joins us after some time, actually. Good evening and welcome back, Sankhitha.
Thank you. Good evening.
Right. So, Sakita, we've seen some progress over the past several months where legislation is concerned. Proceeds of Crime Act has been passed, various other amendments to the Penal Code, and a few other acts have been passed, and there are more to come. But is this enough? When you think of what the public really wants, what they envisaged would happen, is this enough, and what more needs to be done? So let's start with the acts which have been passed. Are you satisfied with what's been passed, or should more have been done?
Well, the biggest piece of legislation that we can start with is the Anti-Corruption Act that was passed in September 2023. Now, this didn't happen because a certain government was in place. This was an initiative that started as early as 2018, actually. And if you look at the Act, it completely recasts and recreates the role of CIABOC, that is the Commission to Investigate Allegations of Bribery or Corruption, or what we know as the Bribery Commission. So it empowers the Bribery Commission to do a lot more than it used to be able to do. And it incorporates new provisions about private sector bribery, for example. And it allows the Bribery Commission to do undercover operations, to do controlled deliveries, to bug people when they're engaging in illicit activities. So the new Bribery Commission really is a different creature altogether under the new Anti-Corruption Act, which we may not expect because it's operating out of the same office. It's called the same thing. So people tend to view it as the same thing. So the Anti-Corruption Act, I know, was also passed without much consultation, and we at the time had to make lots of representations to make it better, to improve it, and kind of wrestle the people's way into the lawmaking process to ensure that it got to where it got to. And I think when you look at it now, while it has certain provisions that could have been better, it's certainly a strong law. And it allows independence to CIABOC in terms of appointment and dismissals. It makes sure that it has access to funding, independent funding aside from the government allocation through the budget. It ensures that CIABOC can get access to fines. It can raise funds independently. So it is not as beholden to the government of a day as it used to be under its previous iteration, under the 1994 Act. So the Anti-Corruption Act, by and large, I think is a good piece of legislation. I think at that point of time, we had the president say that it was the strongest law in Asia. This is not confirmed, but it is certainly a strong law. So in terms of legislation that has been passed, that's the key piece of legislation. And it also allows for better coordination between law enforcement agencies, because we had this perennial problem in Sri Lanka where the CID, CIABOC, the police, etc. would be, or the FCID, would be investigating the same crime without creating a joint task force that addresses the different elements of, a chain of criminal activity. So this allows for that as well. So that these are all positive things. And then the other key piece of legislation that was enacted in Parliament in April this year is this Proceeds of Crime Act. And we have talked about this on a couple of shows before as well. Now, the Proceeds of Crime Act was Sri Lanka's answer to this call for asset recovery. This whole call for, bring us our stolen assets back. The country thought that it would be the solution to all ills, to our economic crisis. Well, that can be true over time. So this Proceeds of Crime Act was Sri Lanka's response, the legislative response to provide for asset recovery through law. So that has also now been enacted. And again, of course, it was the result of successive governments putting a lot of effort into this. We were part of a drafting committee as far back as 2018, where we used to meet weekly and draft this law, and that is the basis upon which the new law has been drafted. So I don't think one government can take credit for it. It has happened over so many governments. Now, the Proceeds of Crime Act also has certain really important features, and one is something that our bloodthirsty citizenry, who are also calling for accountability and asset recovery, will find really interesting. And that is this idea of non-conviction based asset forfeiture. This is a new feature to Sri Lanka's law. It was there to an extent in the Anti-Corruption Act for the corruption offence, but in the Proceeds of Crime Act, it relates to all offences. So what is non-conviction based asset forfeiture? If you have a situation where somebody has obtained an asset through criminal activity, but the person is dead, so there is no longer any claim to that property, the state can now proceed with a case against just that property. And if the state can show on a balance of probability that the property was the proceeds of crime, then the state can confiscate it. So it's a much lower standard than the criminal law's beyond reasonable doubt standard, but it also allows for a possibility of not having to make the connection between the criminal and the criminal activity.
Right.
Because a criminal case is different, right? When you're trying to convict someone, deprive them of their liberty by incarcerating them, the standard is much higher. Here, this of course allows for a bona fide purchaser of that property to come and make representations in court. But if they can show that on a balance of probability the assets are the proceeds of crime, then it can be confiscated to the state. Now, there's an additional layer to this as well that I'm sure our viewers will like to hear about, which is in this non-conviction based asset forfeiture and the Proceeds of Crime Act, there is a presumption that if someone has assets that they can't explain through their known sources of wealth, their legitimate sources of wealth, there is a presumption that it is the proceeds of crime, which makes this non-conviction based asset forfeiture a lot easier to do. And the final question that will arise in our reader's mind is whether this can apply to past crime. Right? This is what everyone asks.
Yeah.
So it's interestingly drafted, because if we were to create retrospective legislation, it would be challenged as being unconstitutional. But what this piece of legislation cleverly does is that it allows you to go after proceeds of crime where the crime occurred before the act was passed.
Right.
As long as it still retains its status as the proceeds of crime, then it becomes fair game under this act.
That's very interesting indeed.
Yes. And one final feature that I'll talk about under this Proceeds of Crime Act is that it allows for and provides for victim compensation. If victims have been stolen from, including the state as a victim, if the state coffers have been stolen from, then it allows for those victims to file action before the district court and claim compensation or damages for the harm that has been caused to them through some form of crime. So that is also a really good standard that has been incorporated, borrowing from international best practices into our law. And it also allows civil society to file representative action, because often we know the poorest, most victimized victims of crime, the poor and the destitute who have already been victimized, often don't have the means or the wherewithal to go to court and, actually litigate their cause. But, and sometimes the harm is so diffuse. We saw this with the economic crisis. The harm is so diffuse that you can't identify one victim who can go and claim representative status for the rest of the country. But this piece of legislation, through some changes that we ourselves advocated for, now allows for civil society organizations to file representative action on for damages and compensation for harm caused through crime. So to your question of legislation already passed, and this one has also now been operationalized as of June 1st, we have some pretty powerful legislation in our arsenal. Of course, they could have been better also, but in terms of international best practice, we are in a good place in terms of legislation. But Sri Lanka is famous for having laws and not implementing. So we have to, as citizens, as journalists, as civil society, constantly be watchful that these are used effectively and not limited to the statute books, but also not abused.
There used to be an old saying, crime doesn't pay. But in Sri Lanka for decades, crime did pay. But now the law has caught up with, making sure that crime doesn't pay. But again, as you said, it's a matter of applying these laws. And I think one of the great things is that this brings in civil society, citizens, media, everyone into the process. You're no longer reliant on the CID or your local police station or the Attorney General. So the balance of probabilities is much more in favor of now going after those, especially those proceeds of crime, as well as the criminals, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't bar us from proceeding against the criminals themselves, but it decouples the criminal from the proceeds of their criminal action so that you can proceed against both. So you have conviction-based asset recovery and non-conviction-based asset recovery provided for, because the question I'm sure will arise in our viewers' minds as to whether we are going to now let the criminals go scot-free while only doing the asset bit, right? The asset recovery bit. That is not what this says. It just makes asset recovery easier while still providing for the safeguards needed for criminals also to represent themselves, to make their representations before court, for them to receive due process, and after a proper conviction to actually still be convicted, punished, penalized as provided for by law.
Interesting. And we will await the actual implementation of these laws, and let's see what can be recovered and from whom, because this is Sri Lanka. It's a small place. Everyone knows everyone, and many people know a lot more about you than you think they do. Your neighbor, for example, knows all the vehicles that you ever had, and you can't hide them anymore because the neighbor can blow the whistle on you. So you risk having vehicles, estates, penthouses, whatever that you may have spent on. All that could now be
forfeited to the state.
Yes.
It's interesting though, we must take caution and take warning from what happened in the UK when they first introduced an equivalent tool into their law called unexplained wealth orders. While it was hailed as this big tool, just like I'm talking about the non-conviction based asset recovery process, it was hailed as this big tool to go after the assets, decoupling it from criminality. However, when the National Crime Agency of the UK went to court the first few times in, I think, the first 10 years of this law being implemented, they found that the criminals often had the best lawyers at their disposal, the best paid lawyers, and would try anything. And this is not new to Sri Lanka also. As we've seen unprecedented things happen in the courts because criminals had access to better lawyers. So it's not going to be easy. It is still going to be challenging for law enforcement to carry these things forward. So they have to do it with caution, do it once they have an airtight case in place and once they have explored all options, and also ensure that they are procedurally sound before they go to court, so they wouldn't be defeated in a court process due to some kind of procedural oversight or procedural overstepping. I mean, if you even look at the Mossack Fonsecas of this world, the law firm that facilitated so much of the crime that was exposed through the Panama Papers, it was procedural issues that got in the way of conviction for crimes like money laundering. So we should be really careful not to be too trigger happy in terms of using these powers. We have to ensure that we do it procedurally correctly, and also once we have an airtight case. Because one other thing that is important for people to remember is that we're all calling for blood, right? Like Sri Lanka is calling for blood and wants to know everything about everything, and I'm all for transparency. But when the criminals, the plunderers, the thieves, the rogues get wind of any kind of investigation against these assets, they will be just as watchful about these new powers that law enforcement has. Asset dissipation becomes a huge issue.
Right.
The moment you get wind of an investigation, the assets will be converted into some other form of assets. It will be taken out of the country. It will be hidden behind some trust somewhere. It will be the provenance of the asset or the source of the assets will immediately be obfuscated as much as possible, or hidden, concealed as much as possible. So it's not an easy game to play. The criminals get ahead much faster.
It is vanity which will finally be the downfall, isn't it? Because
I agree.
If you're a criminal who has stolen billions, but and people may even know that you did so because you've been a powerful minister or whatever. But if you keep that money hidden somewhere in some other country, or or even just buried somewhere, no one knows where it is. Whereas if you go buying a couple of penthouses and a Lamborghini and so on, which many such high-profile criminals actually do, they want to show off.
Yeah.
So that's their downfall.
That is true, and I agree. And I mean, what's the point of stealing if you can't use it, right? I'm not condoning it in any way, but and I agree with you, Niresh, because often it's the kids, the people around them that would be really extravagant and give it away, give the game away. But what is also important to realize is that now we have this heavy reliance on government and law enforcement to fight the entire anti-corruption fight. But one point I've been making recently, because I don't think we talk about this enough, is that we often ignore the role of the private sector in facilitating corruption. And when I say private sector, I'm not necessarily talking about companies and company structures, but I'm talking about those who are referred to as enablers in the anti-corruption world. When we say enablers, we mean lawyers, accountants, auditors, real estate agents who happily accept boxes of cash or bags of cash and do real estate transactions for people, gem jewelry merchants, casino owners. All of these people, at least half of whom are considered professionals who belong to professional bodies, who are the ones really who help launder these proceeds, right? In any kind of corruption situation, you have the Corrupt Act. Say money was stolen from the state coffers by some kind of corruption in a procurement deal. So you have stolen public funds. Now, can the criminal, say in the popular imagination, this is always a politician or a public official. This public official wanted to just go build a house. Could they do it? They could arguably do it, but then it becomes too obvious that this is proceeds of crime, right? How did they suddenly become rich? So who would they go to help them to conceal the fact that this is criminal proceeds. They will go to a company secretary or a lawyer or a real estate agent to help them, or an auditor or an accountant to help them set up another company that makes losses or profits, that then you cook the books and make sure they've lived a little bit of time as a business person, and then they build a house or buy a car. You know, that entire process is facilitated by this group of private sector enablers who seem to think that it's the others doing the corruption. Right? They easily get away because under Sri Lanka's law, and these are not new laws, under the Financial Transactions Reporting Act, under the Money Laundering Act. First, under the Financial Transactions Reporting Act, if a bank or a lawyer receives unexplained cash, the provenance of which or the source of which is unclear, they are supposed to do due diligence on their client to see, are they politically connected? How did they get this money? Should we suspect that this could be corrupt financial flows? They need to ask this question. They need to verify it. And not only do they have to do due diligence, if some kind of suspicion arises that whatever is being told to them is not true, it is their job, all of these people that I named, these so-called professionals and enablers, it is their job to report to the central bank's financial intelligence unit that this is possibly a suspicious transaction. It's called a suspicious transactions report. And then beyond that, if that professional, or anybody for that matter, knew that these were the proceeds of crime. So you have these fixers, right? The professional fixers who do the corruption do the laundering for their very high profile wealthy client who's a corrupt actor. If they knew that these were proceeds of crime, or if they ought to have known, or to have suspected, then if they transact with these proceeds, if they possess it, if they conceal it, if they dispose of it, if they invest it, if they move it in or out of Sri Lanka, they are just as guilty of money laundering.
Right.
Right. So who are really the money launderers is a question we need to be asking ourselves, because it's not just the usual suspects, the politicians, the public officials. It is also those people who are turning the black money into white by these different processes that they do.
Absolutely, and that's a very interesting point, and we'll delve into that a little further. But first, we need to take a short commercial break. Don't go away, because we'll be right back.
Far from the city noise, under a mango tree, children turn broken desks into a stage. They sing, they dance, they try. No bright lights, no big crowds, just a small school and big dreams. Change is coming. An open-air stage for the Kattaragama Primary School. Gammatta, for the people, by the people.
Us your application with your name, your unique talent, your phone number. To Sri Lanka's Got Talent PO Box 100 Ratmalana, or WhatsApp us on 076 599.
We've got some fresh new young talent doing some things that I know you haven't heard before.
ඔබ වයස අවුරුදු 16ට වැඩි නම්
සුවිශේෂී නර්තන රිද්මයන්ගෙන් යුක්ත නම්
ඔබේ හැකියාව රටට පෙන්වීමට හොඳම වේදිකාවයි මේ.
ඔබ සමාජිකයන් 15 අතර කණ්ඩායමක් සමගින් අදම අයදුම් කරන්න.
Sirasa Dancing Star.
නිෂ්පාදක සිරස ඩාන්සිං ස්ටාර් තැපැල් පෙටිය 100 රත්මලාන. WhatsApp 071797788.
Across the nation, talents and dreams are ready to shine. Introducing new faces and extraordinary performances from every corner. We proudly present some of the finest rising stars.
Jumping Cloud Season 2!
June 7th onwards, every Saturday and Sunday at 8:30 p.m. only on Shakti TV.
Welcome back to Face to Face. I am with Attorney at Law Sankhitha Gunaratne, the Head of Governance and Anti-Corruption at Verite Research. Now, Sankhitha, we have all these laws, and you just described them in detail, but it takes a while for the public and the government agencies to come to grips with these laws and to get familiar with them and start actually using them. You may see, of course, a few, like the Bribery Commission might take one of these acts and start applying it. But until perhaps a few months or even years go by, the public and the CID and so on may not be quite familiar with it. How do you sort of, create a shortcut to that? Do you carry out massive awareness campaigns? Should that come from the government? How can we do that?
I think in terms of sensitization of the public agencies themselves, of their new powers and the limits of that power as well, I think it has to happen with government. And they need to still be really open to training from other jurisdictions, to collaborations with other jurisdictions. And one more difficult thing, which is to admit that you don't know what you're doing sometimes. Now in Sri Lanka, they have introduced something called deferred prosecution agreements under the Anti-Corruption Act when you deal with sports bodies, sports associations and the private sector. Now, does SIABOC really have experience doing this? No, because it's an innovation to Sri Lanka's law. So a government also needs to have the humility to accept that it doesn't know and receive training, and also, as I said, hold fire until you're pretty confident that you can get through with these new investigative tools and new prosecutorial tools without risking it on a flop of a prosecution. That's for government, but I think your question was slightly almost two-pronged. That is about how does the public get in line as well? How do we sensitize the public about the fact that the law has changed, that things are different, that perhaps enforcement has the potential to be stronger, to put it mildly, at its weakest form, or is indeed getting stronger. Hopefully, with the government institutions being strengthened, enforcement will be much, much stronger. So with public sensitization, I am not a big fan, personally, of going around telling the public this is what is wrong, this is what is right. I think there needs to be tone from the top, but I don't think the Bribery Commission, for example, should go around training the public and telling them, please don't bribe the school principal when you're admitting your child to school. That is not, I think, a good use of resources. But if they were to put that same resource into actually ensuring that bribery is not demanded at the school principal level, that would be a much better use of resources, and this can be done in different ways. There was this recent decision a couple of days ago of the European Court of Human Rights that talked about integrity testing of public officials. So you know how in the private sector you have these mystery shoppers who go in to private sector organizations and
Yes,
test out the
course,
quality. Yeah. It's a similar concept where you would have somebody pretending to be just a normal citizen going and encountering or asking for a public service from a public official, and they monitor whether there's a demand for bribery. And the moment you do that, the quality of the public service goes up by a much, by leaps and bounds, because anybody walking into your office could be the quote-unquote mystery shopper or the integrity tester. So there are ways to do this. Another good use of resources is for SIABOC to showcase the work that it's doing in terms of arrests, sting operations, Communicating that will build public trust and communicate to the public that action is now taking place. We better fall in line if they were active offenders. But if they are also the public, that segment of the public that felt like they had no choice but to engage in corruption because the entire public service was corrupt, or everyone that they encountered was asking for bribes, then hearing that Siabok is acting this way, or acting with strength, with independence, and being a lot more active, then they would be strengthened to actually complain about those offenders to Siabok. So that kind of communication and tone from the center that things are now serious, we better fall in line, and that we can now seek solace in the law. We can now seek protection through Siabok and not risk reprisals. I think that communication is a lot more important. And another thing to do vis-a-vis the public sector is that you need to create a culture of whistleblowing within the public sector. So
now we have laws for that as well.
We have several laws that deal with whistleblowing in slightly direct and indirect ways. One is the Anti-Corruption Act that says that victims and witnesses should be protected under Siabok, that is the Bribery Commission. We also have a Victim and Witness Protection Authority Act, which defines reporting persons as being whistleblowers. But we also might want to, as a country, consider a proper whistleblowing law and a system that actually positively incentivizes whistleblowing and also protects them very clearly from any type of reprisals. Now, we, as a culture, we're very afraid. Sri Lankans are really afraid. I remember going out to the people training, having multiple hundreds of trainings on the right to information, just about filing a right to information request. And the first question is always, but do I have to put my name? Won't they come after us? Now that has been rare. It has happened, but it has been very rare. But we have this fear. Are our phones being tapped? Are they going to come after us? Will I be vilified, victimized? So that's a fear we have. So to even encourage that whistleblowing culture, those first things that I talked about need to happen, where Siabok, the police, the AG's department, the CID, FCID need to build trust that they're acting without fear or favor and to the full capacity of their powers against those in power, against those who hold public office, in order to incentivize this as well.
Interesting indeed. Yes, Sri Lankans are, well, they used to be quite fearful, but now after the Aragalaya and all that, hopefully it has changed a little bit. But also, I think now there is this sense that you can blow the whistle on some, a colleague in your company or department, and there are quite a number of, I think, anonymous petitions and whole files which are now landing at the CID and Siabok and so on. So now, in the past there was always this fear, but perhaps now it's a little less. Of course, you also get the flip side where people are trying to take revenge on their colleagues and so on. So that's an abuse which has to be dealt with. You mentioned something interesting, the mystery shopper or integrity tester concept. This is not new to Sri Lanka at all, although it's not been used very often. Prior to Siabok, when the bribery department was within the police, this was their modus operandi. They would, because you used to have long queues for a lot of things, and so you have people standing in queue, and especially in the 70s when there was rationing and so on. And of course, some people would try to bribe, and there would be, these detectives from the bribery department who would also come, dressed in civvies, and they would give a bribe. And if the public official took the bribe, then straight off the handcuffs come out. So so that used to happen, but then after Searbach was formed, I think that sort of died down. But again, as you said, this is a very effective way because public officials will be very circumspect about accepting anything. But at the same time, in Sri Lanka, where everyone knows everyone, you could always check whether who is this who's trying to give a bribe, and that situation is also there. But I think it became very brazen in the sense that a couple of weeks ago we had the RMV getting raided, and something like 4 million rupees was discovered in one drawer, which was the proceeds of one morning's take from ill-gotten gains. But a place like that, they just simply take money from anyone just to give a license or whatever. But when it comes to other departments, I think they are a little more circumspect because they want to make sure, especially when it's larger amounts. So the integrity testing would actually be quite useful. What about the public sector? Now, we've changed our politicians by and large. That was easy to do. You just had to vote. Okay. And the judiciary, the bribery commission, they have a newfound sense of freedom and responsibility, perhaps, which we hope has happened. But then you have you spoke of the private sector. You've also got the public sector, which has grown used to taking bribes. That's basically been their way of life for many. Not for all, of course, but for many, it's been their way of life. They may earn 100,000 rupees with their salary, but they'd earn 1 million through ill-gotten gains. And now, all of a sudden, we are asking them to go back to that 100,000, which is almost impossible to do when you're used to spending so much money. You're used to having so much money. It's a psychological thing and a practical thing as well. So how would you deal with that? Because the need to make more money or above your salary is paramount there for many.
I think when you look at the public sector and even the politicians, there is this tendency to want accountability for past crimes. But even as we do that, and we've seen this government really talk that talk of accountability for past crimes, but we must place equal emphasis on systems that can be resilient to even political changes. And one key thing is about disclosure of information and putting systems in place for that. And I think if there's one thing we can do with the public sector, it is that. So you create accountability and you prevent corruption taking place through transparency. Now, you alluded to how people will get ill-gotten gains through public office, but where does that happen? It happens through kickbacks, bribery, speed money, whatever we might call it, or facilitation payments to just get something done fast. Somebody pays something to get something done fast. But the grand corruption level, so the high level or high value corruption, it usually happens in public procurement. Right. So when you look at public procurement, how can we fix the problem? We can have technical evaluation committees, we can have procurement appeal boards, we can challenge it in court. But what if we just focused on the one platform that we have, which is promise.lk, that is supposed to have all of Sri Lanka's procurement information published for the public to be able to see? Journalists, media, civil society, citizens, competing contractors, the private sector can all then just see it. Verite Research has recently done research that has shown that promise.lk's current disclosure levels don't even comply with Sri Lanka's current law on proactive disclosure of information. Based on the Right to Information Act and the guidelines issued thereunder, there should be so much more information disclosed already based on current law. We all talk about new laws being needed, but this is current law. The RTI Act was passed in 2016 and operationalized in 2017. So we did an assessment. We borrowed a methodology from an organization called the Open Contracting Partnership that looks at data on procurement and assesses or identifies corruption red flags within the procurement process. And so when they look at a transaction, if a certain number of red flags are raised, then you would take a closer look at that particular procurement transaction. But for that to happen, we need information, right? So when we overlaid that Open Contracting Partnerships red flag system onto Sri Lanka's promise.lk, we found that at current levels of disclosure, you could only calculate 9 of those 73 red flags. Just 9. But if Sri Lanka actually conformed to its current disclosure requirements under law, the number of red flags goes up to 23 of 73 red flags.
So and that's then current law.
Current law. Right. So that's a huge jump from 9 to 23. And then if you were to calculate what are the most useful red flags from the remaining most useful information fields from the remaining information you can disclose, then you can increase the number of, exponentially increase the number of red flags, corruption red flags that you can identify. Now, what do I mean when I say corruption red flags? For example, if the different bidders that are bidding on a contract are related to each other, that's a red flag. If the time period between the opening of a bid and the closing of a bid for a highly complicated bid is very short, that's a corruption red flag. So these are the kinds of, it's almost common sense. We know these things. But for us to be able to do that, coming back to my point, we need information disclosure systems put in place. So I think it was Barack Obama who said that sunlight was the best disinfectant. So we introduce transparency and create practices of information disclosure so that you prevent corruption from happening on the one hand, and also are able to detect corruption when something untoward is happening, so that the system can be resilient, as I said at the start, beyond just the cycle of a certain set of politicians exercising their political will. And beyond that, we have found in Sri Lanka and through the different types of litigation we have engaged in, that have come through journalistic exposés that very skilled investigative journalists have done in Sri Lanka, what we find is that without that visibility, without transparency and a public push or a scandal happening, nothing really changes in Sri Lanka. So that the resilience I'm talking about is resilience to political change, and it's also, in a way, if we build that kind of system, it's resilience to capture. Right. If we have those systems in place, we've talked about state capture, of how Sri Lanka's institutions have been prone to capture in the private interests of a few powerful individuals rather than the public interest, which should be paramount in any kind of public exercise, in the use of public funds, in the carrying out of public functions, in the carrying out of public duties. So to be able to build that resilience, you need to create a habit, a system of information disclosure and accountability so that prevention and detection can both take place.
Well, when you talk about capture, in Sri Lanka it's been very simple. You are appointed the minister of whatever, and you have 5 different corporations under you, and each one is assigned to a cousin or your brother-in-law or somebody, and there you have it. And the employees of each of those institutions, they are quite aware, and they are told, oh, this is the minister's cousin. So whatever that chairman will now instruct will happen because he's the minister's cousin. So so even technical evaluation committees, tender boards, they always had this sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. So it's nepotism really, which does this, but it's not just relatives. It's classmates. It's all kinds of people. So people who are connected to invariably a minister or a state minister or deputy minister. So that's the issue with capture. Hopefully that will go out. But now some countries have nepotism laws. You can't sort of have your wife appointed as the chairman or your husband or any relative. I think the famous example was John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, where under John F. Kennedy, who was president, Robert Kennedy was, I think, the Attorney General. So this was clearly nepotism. But the US then changed that system. But here in Sri Lanka, we haven't changed that system. We still can appoint our relatives, even though, of course, we raise a big brouhaha in the media saying that this was so and so. But do we need new laws like that to come in to strengthen this and to make sure that capture doesn't happen?
I think law can always be strengthened further, but let me talk about two elements of the existing law, both in the anti-corruption.
I'm afraid we're almost out of time, so
I keep it short. One is there are new conflict of interest provisions that have been introduced through the Anti-Corruption Act. So if some officer of an agency is trying to deal with another party that raises a conflict, then that officer needs to raise it, and there are sanctions for not doing so. And the second thing is the asset declarations that we've talked so much about, the assets and liabilities declarations of public officials, senior public officials and politicians also are supposed to contain and disclose assets locally and abroad of dependent children, whatever their age, spouses, etc. So these are systems that have been set in place to hopefully build that resilience, but transparency of all of these systems is also important. That's why asset declarations are now supposed to be made public. In the same way, you would have seen the Civil Society Governance Diagnostic Report actually call for conflict of interest registers to be made public. Right. So that kind of resilience can be built through public accountability.
So when you say made public, I'm afraid the public has a very short attention span. And then it gets lost in the sands of time. What about the importance of digitalization? Because once it goes digital, which this government has promised vast amounts of digitalization, basically you've got it online. I mean, on your smartphone, you can check, a minister's assets or whatever. So shouldn't that be the yardstick here?
Absolutely agree. I couldn't agree more, and thank you for saying that. Sri Lanka is right now building several digital systems. There's the e-government procurement platform, Promise.lk. We are currently building a central electronic system for asset declarations to make asset declarations public. We are about to pass a law on beneficial ownership, that is, who are the true human owners of companies. Right. However far their ownership might be, who's the true ultimate human owner who's benefiting from it. So we are building a beneficial ownership register, but there's no requirement in the law to make it digital or publicly accessible, electronic in any sense. Then we are also, the Election Commission has promised that they will make campaign finance reports publicly available through a system, a digital system. But we are not thinking also of the customs system, the Indian revenue system. If we can make all of this interoperable and available to law enforcement, even the RMB data when people purchase vehicles, then the net becomes way too difficult to get away from. But there's always been hesitation to do this. So even right now, while we're introducing all these laws and digital systems, it feels like an opportunity squandered with Sri Lanka's huge digital transformation push, if we were not to use that digital transformation push to make these different systems interoperable in a way that can truly respond to the issue of illicit financial flows and corruption in Sri Lanka?
Well, I think we just need to keep up the pressure.
Absolutely.
The media and organizations such as yours. And I'm afraid we're out of time. My thanks to Attorney at Law Sankhitha Gunaratne, Head of Governance and Anti-Corruption and Deputy Director of Verite Research for joining me this evening.
Thank you for having me, Neeraj.
And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.